All right, Evan Miyakawa, advanced analytics on college basketball at evanmiyA.com. It's Dr. Evan Miyakawa, and he's been on our show many times along with some networks as well, and he joins us on Sikkim 365 Radio and 365 Sports. Evan, thanks for your time. One of the latest graphics you have, I think, Armstrong, do we have it to put up while we're talking to Evan if we can? It was recently you mentioned which teams have the best depth. And not only do you list about 30 teams or so, whoever they are, you also have all these arrows of what teams are doing. And Baylor's off like third, but their depth, of course, has dropped a little bit with injuries and much more. What made you kind of get into this?
Yeah, so I think looking at depth from the perspective of which teams have the most impactful players, both at the top, how impactful is your best player, but then as you work your way down the rotation, is there a drop or are you still getting production from your bottom of the rotation guys? I think this graph is really interesting because for a team like Baylor, it shows that they have a huge gap between their most impactful player, which right now is rated as Matthew Meyer, but Adam Flagler is up there as well, James Akinjo. And then when you look at their eighth most impactful player in their rotation right now, due to injuries, it's Dale Bonner. And Dale Bonner, credit to him, he's played really well, but that's a significant step down from, say, if Flo Thamba is your eighth most impactful player, which is the rotation that they had before these injuries to Jonathan Tchamwa-Tchatchoua and now LJ Cryer being out. So it really illustrates that Baylor has some work to do in terms of maybe competing with other teams in a similar with similar ratings at the bottom of their rotation. You look at other teams like Gonzaga, Arizona, and even a team like Texas. They don't have the star power that Baylor does, but their rotation top to bottom is all pretty close. Chris Beard has a lot of guys who are very, very similar and can step in, and there's almost no drop-off in production. So I think the graph really illustrates some of these nuances, both in terms of star power, but also in terms of team depth.
Evan, when it comes to the tournament, how do you think that this will affect them matching up against other teams? Because there's not a lot of teams that really do go 8 deep, but if they found one that did, that could be a problem.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things to consider. One is certainly foul trouble. Obviously, some teams can play a really short rotation, 7 guys. Villanova has done that a lot of years, where they just have their best 7 and they run out there. But if you have a game where you're playing against a really tough team, a physical team, which you're often going to see in March Madness, and they're, putting you in situations where your guys are in foul trouble and you have to dip into that bench a little bit, that really becomes, something that you have to think about. And so I look at teams like this, and I'm looking for teams that both have star power, have guys that are big impact players, but then also teams that have what I would call a higher floor in terms of the rotation. And so I do think that Baylor, compared to some of these other teams that have similar metrics or resume, and be in a similar range in terms of seed, I do think it's a little bit worrisome that when they're going down and they're having a guy like Dale Bonner, who hasn't played a minute of D1 basketball before this season, having him play significant minutes, I do think they are at a bit of a disadvantage compared to other similarly rated teams like, say, Kentucky, Kansas, Villanova, etc., when it comes down to more of these Sweet 16, Elite 8 matchups. That'll be something to watch.
You mentioned that, like, for example, Texas has better depth. They don't have some of maybe the elite players that Baylor has, but they have better depth. And yet in that game Monday, Evan, near the game's on the line, yeah, some of Baylor's stars took over, but they were able to grind through a tough physical game, even with some cases without the depth.
Yeah, I think the last 2 games for Baylor, they have been up against it, and they could have easily walked away from these games versus Kansas and Texas with 2 losses, and I don't think anyone would have faulted them for that. So to me, I think the big characteristic for this Baylor team right now is toughness and resilience, and I think you could argue they're the toughest team in the nation right now. Certainly there are a few other teams you could throw in there recently, like Arkansas or Wisconsin or Providence, but I mean, Baylor's toughness and resiliency to play really hard, especially in the game against Kansas, where it sort of reminded me the beginning of that game, like the national championship game last year, where Baylor just put Gonzaga to bed and they were never in it. That's how the beginning of the game felt for me on Saturday versus Kansas. And then Baylor fought back and earned their way back in that game, even without Jonathan Tchamwa-Tchatchoua, LJ Cryer. So I think their toughness really sticks out to me right now.
I love what you said, that they put Gonzaga to bed, because that's exactly what it was. Mm-hmm. It was like, all right, time for bed. You know, kids today probably argue with that. Back then, mom and dad said go to bed, you went to bed, right? I love the way you said they put Gonzaga to bed, because that's exactly, they put them the night pretty quickly.
Yeah. I mean, that was as dominant an opening stretch. And, I mean, Gonzaga certainly, played hard the rest of the game, but Baylor never let them get a glimpse of a shot in that game, whereas Baylor, on the opposite end of that, on Saturday, in a game where you could have expected them to, just give up, they fought their way back, and they earned that one. So that, to me, is a great sign going forward.
Evan, when you look around nationally, there are, there's so much flux in the top 10, especially this last week. Does that tell you anything about how you think that they'll perform in the tournament, or what the tournament is going to shake out like?
Yeah, I think, Saturday was one of the most historic days in, college basketball regular season history, with the top 6 teams all losing, and Baylor somehow came through that unscathed. To me, that speaks to, number one, people have been discounting Baylor because of these injuries, and certainly I think if they don't have a healthy Cryer in the tournament, that's going to hurt. But I do think that this shows that they are as capable as any of these teams in, the top 8, top 10 to, make some noise in the tournament. You never know what's going to happen. I do think, if Cryer isn't healthy, right now I have Baylor rated as the 5th best team in the nation, but if you account for Cryer's injury right now, that drops them to 10th. So I think that lowers their ceiling a little bit. So that's a big piece. But I do think there's so many different teams that are all really close, and Baylor's right in the mix, for a national championship.
So you have this other graph, and I mean, I think maybe you're like a mad scientist, or like one of those guys in the lab with a beaker and chemicals. But you have all the kill shots, the 10-0 runs, which of course Baylor had a 9-0 run that put away Texas when that game was on the line, and what they did a couple of times to Kansas. Who right now? What are the percentages, Evan, when someone, no matter when, has a 10-0 run during a game?
Yeah, so this is something new I've started tracking this year, and I just think it adds a whole new dimension to the way that we watch games. So I have this term called a kill shot, which just means a team going on a 10-0 run or better. So when you score at least 10 points unanswered, how many teams are doing that, per game? And when a team has more kill shots in a game than the other team, they win 83% of the time. So that really speaks to, these teams that are able to go on scoring spurts and not allow them on the defensive end, they have a much, much better chance of winning the game. So, right now, Gonzaga leads the nation in kill shots. They have 36 of them total this season. That's about 1.3 per game. So they're more likely to have a 10-0 run than not in a game, which is pretty wild. Baylor is, a step below that, but they're in a group of these top teams from power conferences. They've had 27 of these kill shots this year and have only allowed 11. So they stick out to me as one of these teams that has the ability in any game to go on a scoring run, and they don't allow many of them themselves. So I think that speaks to the fact that, number one, like a game against Kansas where they're down, they're never out of it. They can always go on one of these scoring runs and bring themselves back in it.
Yeah, I would think, 10-0 run, it doesn't always mean you're going to win, but the odds are, the stats are, the trends are that, that was the thing. I can't remember. Did you do that last year on 10-0 runs at all? Because Baylor, Paul, you used to say this. If they ever got you 3 possessions down, how much it took to get back to 3 possessions back. But they used to go on these 8 to 10, 12-point runs that were dead.
Yeah, it was when they got to 8 points. It seemed like it was really hard to go 3 possessions in a row with stop score.
Yeah, I think that's a Scott Drew staple. He's got these Baylor teams going on runs and, not giving them up. And I think it speaks to, consistency year over year, that this has been a behavior that Baylor as a basketball team has had, not just this year, but in years in the past. I did only start tracking that this year, so I don't have the numbers from last year, but I would imagine that it's even more dominant from last year in terms of, going on these kill shots in games.
All right. From Stephen Snook on our chat room, Stephen from up in Ohio, Evan is off the charts, quite literally, very interesting. So we appreciate that as well. So do you wake up in the middle of the night with a little sticky note, or like one of those little recorders and say, okay, what about this? Is something that you get up the next day and start working on as a trend?
Yeah, well, as you know, I watch every single minute of every single college basketball game. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
I do have, for every idea that I'm able to follow through on and, produce some graphic or add something to my site, there's always 4 more that I think about and put in the queue. So I'm always coming up with stuff. Well,
it's great. It's great. And earn the doctorate. What's it like now when people call you Dr. Miyakawa?
It's definitely different. It still feels unreal to a certain degree. So yeah, I'm just so thankful that I was able to, get that degree from Baylor, which has been an incredible school. And it's just been awesome.
Thank you, Evan. Appreciate it as always. Evan Miya, Miya on Twitter. And also you can go online with Evan Miyakawa, what he does online with his charts and trends. So at Evan Miya on Twitter. And then you could also go to Evan Miya, Miya.com for a lot of what he does statistically, trends, data, and we appreciate his time. We'll have Max Olson today just after 4 o'clock.